Hey everybody, this is Mr. Jones coming with you again to carry your. We're I can't talk today. We are steadily going through Unit 5 on Industrialization and Revolution, and today this video is going to be topic 5.8 called Reactions to the Industrial Economy. Now, in our previous video, we talked about how capitalism really works. And we looked at monopolies, and we looked at laissez-faire, and all these new ideas that sprung up out of industrialization. Today, we're going to look at some reactions to that, and I think, even though this is going to sound a little weird at first until I explain it, the reactions that you're going to hear about this are some of the reactions you hear in today's political world about our capitalist system. So let's get started. This is reactions to the industrial economy. Here's the thing. Industry, it's tough. It is a rough gig. There are harsh conditions in places like coal mines and factories, and people are making very little money, and they're working 16 to 18 hours a week. Meanwhile, the corporate bosses are raking in all the profits, and the people just don't. They just don't seem to have any kind of rights or things like that. So we're going to look at this today in a couple of stages. Number one, we're going to look at social reform, alternative views of society, and that's going to be another ism, actually a couple of isms that we'll talk about later. Workers' unions, this is when workers finally unite. And lastly, government-sponsored reforms. So let's kind of dive right in to some of this. So let's look at some of the reform movements here. Some of the early reform movements you can see in my illustration here, and I'll just stand out of the way. Labor unions. A labor union. Now, on the AP test, you may want to use the term trade union. It actually means the same thing. People knew that reforms needed to happen because of dangerous, unsanitary working conditions, low wages, and long hours. And you can see in the pictures here some of the problems and some of the reform movements that will start because of that. Labor unions are forming, organizations of workers starting to advocate for the right to bargain with their employer because these workers wanted a contract. They wanted a contract that would protect them from some of the things that these folks are doing to them. The government back in this time was not nearly as friendly as it is friendly to businesses as it is today. There were no corporate bailouts, there were no stimulus packages passed or things like that. No. Businesses and the people working for them were on their own in those days. So they treated unions as the enemies of trade. Now, all unions wanted, now see if any of this sounds familiar, they wanted minimum wage, because back then owners paid whatever they whatever the people were willing to work for. They're working too much. 16, 18 hours is a lot. They wanted pay for overtime if they did work, and they wanted a 5-day work week. Now think about that, how radical that is. We go to school, well, back when we used to do that, we went to school Monday through Friday, and we would take Saturday and Sunday off. And that was not the reality for these folks. They worked 7 days a week. They may get a shorter work day on Sunday because that's the Sabbath. But other than that, they were not treated very well at all. That's all labor unions were advocating for. Please understand that. Voting rights. Great Britain expanded voting access in 1832, 1867, and in 1884. And so when I say they expanded voting rights, don't go thinking, oh, they finally did the right thing. It's a slow process. It's a slow burn. They lowered the amount of property that white men needed to vote. Well, as you can see, that's very limiting. Well, that's fine. 1918, 102 years ago, Britain said all men could vote. And then by 1928, all women. And as you can see, just by looking at Great Britain's example, there are still some marginalized groups that still are disenfranchised from the right to vote. By the way, disenfranchisement means taking away somebody's right to vote, or at least limiting their right to vote. Child labor, big issue. We're all going to deal with it. We're dealing with it even now. For those of y'all that have part-time jobs, you are subject, and your employer is subject to child labor laws. And again, those are very difficult to enforce sometimes. But in 1843, children under the age of 10 were not allowed to work in coal mines. Now think about what that means. That means at some point in history they were allowed to work in coal mines. In fact, they were expected to work in coal mines. Coal mining is a work that is absolutely hazardous, no matter what your age is. In 1881, education becomes mandatory for British children because they figured it's just hazardous to work in a coal mine, and their time could be much better spent getting an education so that they could better themselves and one day not have to do that. And so what happens is, in 1881, starting in Europe, since the focus on children shifts away from factory work into education, that's going to change the role of children completely. And that is something that is a continuity through time. It has stayed true today. So these are really, really important reform movements, as you can see here. Labor unions are, even though today they have different kinds of issues, they really are the backbone of the early labor movement. Again, it goes without saying, but feel free to stop the video at any time if you need to take some notes, or if you have any questions, be sure to comment down in the comments section. Intellectual reaction. This is interesting. John Stuart Mill, who wrote a book called On Liberty, believed, and this goes in direct argument against Adam Smith, who you learned about in the previous video, was that Scottish philosopher, the economist, who said laissez-faire is the only way to go. Government has no right to interfere in anything. John Stuart Mill says, yeah, but laissez-faire capitalism is inhumane. I should say inhumane, not inhuman, to laborers. He wanted labor unions. He wanted limits to child labor and safe working conditions. In other words, he is kind of fueling the reform movements that were occurring that I talked about in the previous slide. He advocates for something called utilitarianism. Now, for those of y'all that may be on the speech and debate team and you take part in Lincoln Douglas debate, you may have heard of utilitarianism. But if you haven't, this is simply what it means. That it is anything you do should be for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. In other words, reform is very moderate, it's very gradual, and that's the only way to do it. And this is to create some kind of a perfect society known as a utopia. Utopians wanted to replace capitalism, whereas utilitarians wanted to fix the problems that existed very moderately, very gradually. If you think about it, our laws today operate under the auspices of utilitarianism, that it's for the greatest good for the greater number of people. And that has been a widely accepted model in Western culture. Now let's switch gears entirely and talk about Karl Marx. Karl Marx offers an alternative view of society. I mentioned this earlier, one of the isms. First of all, Karl Marx was German, and actually he's pictured right here, right there, the guy with the big beard. He is actually a German scholar. I don't read anything into that. I don't claim him as an ancestor. But he and Friedrich Engels wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto. And this is really what he says in that very short and extremely boring book. He says that capitalism is basically feudalism. Now, you remember what feudalism was. We talked about that a couple of months ago. Because some are rich and some are poor. He doesn't know the difference between feudalism and manorialism, first of all. But I digress. He says the problem in this kind of society is that there are two classes. There is a working class, the poor working class, which he calls the proletariat. And then there is the middle and upper class, which are your investors who own all the machinery and the means of production, called the bourgeoisie. In other words, these are the haughty ones that control all the money. You know, they're the bougie ones. I know y'all have heard that expression, bougie. Well, that's what bougie means. It comes from that word, bourgeoisie. Okay, it just kind of means your status is a little bit elevated. Okay, and the bourgeoisie always exploits the proletariat. So he offers a socialist idea. Under socialism, classes would not exist. Period. And the proletariat should be the ones running the means of production, where all wealth is shared equally. So in my factory, if I'm the boss and you are all my workers, and every profit that we make shouldn't, the owner shouldn't get all the wealth and just pay the people. What should happen is that all of us, myself included, we should all get equal amounts of wealth. That is basically socialism in a nutshell. There are arguments for socialism, but I must tell you that the arguments for socialism often come from those who are downtrodden and poor. On the other hand, the arguments against socialism are very, very much come from people that are either entrepreneurs or they have that entrepreneurial spirit. In America, we have that entrepreneurial spirit, which means we don't like things like this. But as more and more groups in this country today, I'm talking 2020 now, are marginalized, you now see a lot of people starting to re-embrace socialism as a way to get themselves out of that situation and be as equal as everybody else. We know that there are so many flaws in this way of thinking, so many flaws, in fact, that I will just say it here and now, no country in the world has ever been truly a communist country, period. They might say that they're communist, but nobody has actually done it the way Karl Marx wrote about. So that's the first thing we understand. Now you'll notice here I have the Soviet flag. This is from the Soviet Union, which embraced communism during the Cold War. And they're probably the closest thing you come to, but remember, do not confuse socialism with totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is a dictatorship which takes away people's rights. Socialism is purely an economic system. The problem is it is often enforced by totalitarian dictatorships. Blah, that's a lot of big words. But look at all the examples. Look at North Korea. Look at Kim Jong-un right now. They claim to be a communist country. And perhaps they have a lot of communist policies. But look at how they're run. They're run by a totalitarian dictator who does not give his own people basic civil rights that we have. That's important to understand. So when you write, since your AP exam is going to be all free response questions, if you ever write about communism or socialism and you write about it in a context of a totalitarian dictatorship, you need to express that that is how that's done. It's in a communist context. It's in a dictator context. Okay? In other words, we talk about dictators like Napoleon Bonaparte, who we mentioned several videos ago. We consider him a dictator, but we don't consider him a socialist. Okay? Are there any socialists out there that are non-dictators? Well, the first one comes to my mind is Karl Marx, because he is only a philosopher. So please keep in mind that this actually does not originate from the political spectrum at all. It originates from the economic situation caused by the Industrial Revolution. Let me step off of that soapbox and into the next slide. Hopefully that's clear on you, but if not, I encourage you to ask questions. Let's switch gears now. Let's talk about the Ottoman Empire. Let's look at the Ottomans' response to industrialization. By the mid-1800s, the Ottomans were still very behind in terms of industrialization. You might remember their nickname they have earned by this point. They're known as the sick man of Europe, even though technically they're not in Europe. Well, part of them is, but part of them is also in Asia, the Middle East. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II finally made some reforms. He abolished the Janissaries. Okay, you might remember the Janissaries. This is the Christian young men that are taken in to uphold the Ottoman way, if you will. Instead, they made a new military trained by Europeans. They completely abolished the old feudal system in which military officers could no longer tax people. Aha! See, the Ottoman Empire knew the real definition of feudalism, unlike Karl Marx. You see roads built, a postal service is established, charities are secularized, and European-style government ministries are also created. So the Ottoman Empire is trying to westernize itself a little bit. For them, though, it's going to be too little too late, especially once World War I breaks out, which, sadly, your AP test is not going to test you over because it's one of my favorite things in history. This is my sad face. Okay. The Tanzimat reforms. This is important. This is in your packet. The Tanzimat reforms. Tanzimat, it means reorganization, and this happens after Mahmud, after his reign is over. The idea is to root out corruption, to secularize education, and remember, secularize means don't make it religious, right? It's Ottoman Empire is under the belief system of Islam. That's no longer going to be the case. Ottoman laws are now going to be codified, which means they're going to be written down, and they're going to be also not based on religion. They're going to be based on things like, the rule of law, kind of what they should be based on. The Hati Humayun is one of the things that updates the legal system and promises equality for all men in education, government appointments, and justice, regardless of ethnicity or religion. The Ottoman economy becomes cash-based, and it's about time. Banking increases. Industrialization is still spreading very slowly. The Ottoman Empire is very, very slow to get this done. And as you can see, it only is going to mostly help men. Women will actually lose rights under the Tanzimat reforms. In the 1870s onward, we see many sultans start being very jittery and afraid of reforms. The sultan named Abdul Hamid exiled a group called the Young Turks. The name is pretty self-explanatory. These are young members of the Ottoman Empire that are kind of protesting some of these reforms going on. And he's going to exile them. So much for freedom of assembly and freedom of petition, right? He will create anger against minority groups, and what you're going to see is 100 to 250,000 Armenian Christians being killed in a genocide. And of course, he's going to be known as the Red Sultan, or that's going to be known as the Red Sultan. And so what you see there is reform and industrialization is going to be halted in the Ottoman Empire. So in a nutshell, that's the Ottoman Empire for you. And again, feel free to pause to take notes here, because I know this is a part of the world that we're not all too familiar with. Let's head over one more slide, and let's look at reform efforts in China real quick. First of all, the Chinese are in what's known as a self-strengthening movement. The Qing dynasty now is what's taken hold here. And the idea behind this is to strengthen China by advancing military technology, the manufacturing of arms and ships, setting up a diplomatic corps to interact with other nations, and a customs service to help collect taxes on imports and exports. China is very much in the need at this time of having a stable government that can collect taxes in order to remain a somewhat dynasty. So China lost a war to Japan, by the way. And that should say lost, not last. But after China lost a war to Japan, a reformer named Kang Yaowei met with Emperor Guangzhou and called for these reforms. And see how familiar these sound based on the context we've looked at here in this particular unit module. The abolition of the civil service exam, the elimination of corruption, and the establishment of Western-style industrial, commercial, and medical systems. I think we're starting to see exactly where Eurocentrism, that means a focus on the way Europe and the West has done things. We now see why that's occurring. It's being birthed by other cultures, like the Ottomans, like the Chinese. Stands to reason now why we think Western culture is somehow more advanced. In the issue of economics and in social reform, it stands to reason. So the response to this reform, the Dowager Shiji, that's right here, this is the aunt of Yue Wei, she did not want to reform, and she led a coup d'etat to replace him. Remember, a coup d'etat is a sudden and often violent overthrow of the government. She's afraid of foreign influence, and she resists new technology like the railroad and the telegraph. So she's very conservative, very old school. She does realize, however, that the civil service exam was corrupt, and so she got rid of it. She's the one that finally gets rid of it. This has been around for 2.5 millennia in China. No more civil service examination. We talked about that a couple of months ago and just how cumbersome that was. No more. That's about as progressive as she gets. Now, if we compare Europe and China, here is kind of the difference. Europe wants China to change. They will help China modernize despite something called the Boxer Rebellion. I encourage you to look that up in your textbooks because that was another interesting episode. We actually talk about that a little bit more, believe it or not, in my regular world history class. But there was a rebellion to kick out foreign people and to end her conservatism. China became so weak that they had to accept protection from Western powers who in return wanted trade. So there always comes an opportunity, and you better believe the West is going to pounce on that opportunity. So in 1911, China will become a republic for the first time ever. The Qing dynasty is the last dynasty of China, and that remains true to this day. However, we know that China today is not a republic, but in 1911 they were. Now, the United States is the country that helps China resist encroachment from surrounding areas. I should say areas. We are the ones, the U.S. were the ones to protect China because we wanted to monopolize our trade with them. China was slow to industrialize, but still. So our relationship with China has been in the works for a long time, at least for 100 years. Now, in 1949, this is all going to change when China becomes communist, which is where they remain today. And lastly, let's cover real quickly. I know this has been kind of a longer video, but it's full of important information. Let's look at resistance and limits to reform. Look at this. In Japan, in 1871, they abolished the samurai, or as I like to say it, samurai. Some served the government as genros. Some resisted change. They wanted to stay autonomous from central government, and they will try to fight with their own government, and they will lose. Japan has a lot of internal problems. China has a lot more external problems. And some reforms are more successful than others. Education reforms improved literacy. Let's be honest, the Japanese have never looked back on that. The economy rapidly industrialized, and the Japanese have not looked back on that. And look at this. Some democratic traits grow out of this. A free press, labor unions, individual liberties. Not bad for Japan. Our friends in the Ottoman Empire, they tried to industrialize, but nervous leaders who didn't support reform hurt them. That's them in a nutshell. China will industrialize later. Conservative leaders became more liberal, but reform does take a while to spread. And lastly, Japan will rapidly industrialize with the Meiji Restoration. But conservative members of society continue to resist change. So this has kind of been a long video, but I still encourage you to watch Steve Heimler's review on this because he's going to put a little bit more illustration into what we've talked about today, just so you can understand it. And the link to Steve Heimler's video on this topic is right here, so you can click on that now. And in the next video, we're going to look at the effects of the industrial age on society. We're going to get a little bit more personal. So I'll see you all in the next video. Have a great day and take care of yourself.